Hi, everybody. Welcome to the last webinar of 2017 for the OBM Network. My name is Dr. Heather McGee, and I will be talking about systems analysis today. So let's get right to the presentation. Just a note, feel free to leave comments or questions in the chat bar. But unfortunately, once I have the PowerPoint up, I won't be able to see the chat, so we'll save them till the end and we'll leave time at the very end to go through those. All right, let's see if I can make this work. Okay, oh, it looks like I can see the chat. Great, fantastic. All right, so what I'm going to talk about today is taking a 3 levels approach to performance analysis improvement. This is pretty common in systems analysis, although some folks will look at up to 5 or 6 different levels of analysis. The 3-level approach is probably the most common. Well, maybe. Okay, there we go. All right, so within the field of organizational behavior management, you really have 2 general approaches. The first being behavioral systems analysis, and the second being performance management. Hang on, I just want to check. I see a comment. I want to make sure that everyone can see my screen. Technical difficulties. Okay, good. All right, we're good to go. All right, so OBM or organizational behavior management, we can think of as having sort of 2 branches, one being behavioral systems analysis or BSA, and the other being performance management or PM. And most folks are probably more familiar, if you're familiar with OBM, with the performance management branch. And that's not at all surprising, considering the performance management branch is really the straight application of behavior analytic concepts and principles to the workplace. So with performance management, or identifying and manipulating those antecedents and consequences that are directly associated with some target behavior or target behaviors. And when we do performance management, we're often doing things like setting goals, clarifying performance expectations, providing feedback and reinforcement, maybe using task clarification and job aids or incentives to improve performance. So ABC analysis and ANC interventions. When we're talking about systems analysis, we're going quite a bit broader than performance management. In systems analysis, we're looking at the organization as a whole, and we're treating the organization as an adaptive system, meaning the organization needs to be able to respond to external and internal changes. Additionally, if we're doing systems analysis, one of the most important things to remember is that if you make a change in one part of your organization, it is going to affect other parts of your organization. And looking beyond the change you're making is how we ensure that A, your changes maintain, but B, your changes don't inadvertently cause harm in some other part of the organization. Another basic tenet of systems is that we view organizations as being cross-functional and having multiple levels of performance. Cross-functional just means that organizations are made up of multiple departments or functions or job roles. And when we look at performance and try to identify opportunities to improve performance, we need to be looking at how those departments or functions or job roles are interacting and impacting one another. The various levels of performance means that we look at, yes, the performer level and the A's and B's and C's, but we also look at processes that cut across jobs or departments or functions. And we want to look at the organization as a whole. So what are the resources being brought in? What are the products or services being produced? For whom are they being produced? So who are the customers? What's going on in the external environment? Lots of bigger variables. And then finally, we want to ensure that when we do performance management, and in systems analysis, we absolutely do performance management, we ensure that there is a comprehensive performance management and measurement system that's in place across levels, both up and down the organization and across, to make sure that we really are ready for the changes we're making and ready to adapt to any future changes. So if you're comparing systems to performance management, they both involve performer level change, but the BSA interventions are likely to also involve things like process re-engineering or process change or new process design, changes at the leadership level in terms of how resources will be allocated to the various jobs or departments or functions, developing and implementing strategy, ensuring that goals at any level of the organization are aligned all the way up through the strategy level, and including those bigger picture variables that are less directly tied to a specific target behavior or a specific task for a specific job. That's what really sets systems apart from performance management. What I like to tell students in my classes is that for all intents and purposes, you could really consider performance management to be part of BSA. So the three-level approach is organization level, process level, performer level. And at the performer level, we're doing performance management. So sometimes I think it's helpful just to start with definitions. And I think with systems analysis, especially because I do think that different folks talk about it in different ways, I like to define it by breaking down the terminology. I think we all know what behavioral means in our field, but a system is just a group of interacting, interrelated, or interdependent elements that form a complex whole. And analysis is the breaking up or separation of something into its parts so as to examine them and see how they fit together. So systems analysis, we're looking at a group of interacting, interrelated, interdependent elements of the system that come together to form the organization as a whole. But then for the analysis, we break that down into the component pieces at various levels of performance. In a nutshell, we're looking at how organizations work and how they should work. And our focus is always going to be on outcomes or results first, and then focusing on the system itself and the behavior changes necessary to produce those outcomes or results. In ABA, Applied to Organizations, or OBM, we're there to ensure that the organization is able to meet the needs of its customers. And that means we really have to keep our eye on outcomes and results and work our way backward from there. It would be too easy to say, oh, this is a behavior I want to change, or this is a behavior that a supervisor or a manager thinks needs to change, and get really caught up in time and effort and money in a lot of cases changing that behavior. But if that doesn't in some way contribute to better products or services for our customers, we may be misplacing that time and energy and money. So another bit of breakdown here, how does behavior analysis fit into behavioral systems analysis? Really, you can think of BSA from the theoretical perspective as being applied behavior analysis got married to general systems theory. ABA, as everyone knows in this webinar, I'm sure, is the application of the science and behavior. We're interested in prediction and control of socially important behaviors. That's what puts the A in ABA, the applied. And in the case of OBM and in behavioral systems analysis, we're specifically concerned with prediction and control of socially important behaviors in the workplace. General systems theory brings in those other layers, those more distal variables that affect performance. And general systems theory gives us a framework for understanding organizational systems by looking at the relationships between parts of the system and the relationships between the system and the external environment. So not just looking inside the organization, but also looking at how that organization fits into perhaps this larger industry, the community, how it's impacted by and impacts changes external to itself, things like changes in regulations or licensure requirements. For those of you who work in ABA applied to the area of autism, there are always governmental and the federal and state and local mandates and licensure and certification requirements that are outside the direct control of your organization, but you most certainly need to be abiding by those changes and preparing for them as they come. Just one last point about the difference between performance management and systems analysis, but specifically the difference between looking at only the performer level versus looking at performance system-wide. You can work just with individuals in the organization. You can do just performance management. The problem is if you're doing that in the context of a bad system, there's very little that your individual performer can do. And what you're likely to see happen is small change in performance or maybe immediate change in performance that then goes back to where it was before once the intervention's been in place for a while. That usually indicates in OBM, at least, that there are some system issues that we didn't identify and didn't address, and those system variables are exerting a lot of control over behavior. One of my favorite quotes is from Rumler and Braich's Improving Performance book, and that is, if you pit a good performer against a bad system, the system will win almost every time. So as I mentioned at the beginning, we're going to be looking at a 3 levels approach to performance improvement. The 3 levels are the organization level, looking at the entire organizational system and how it interacts with the external environment, as well as how the departments or functions within the organization interact with each other. Then we will talk about the process level. This is workflow, looking at how the work actually gets done in an organization. And then finally, we'll move on to the performer level, which is looking at individual jobs within the organization, the job supports that are necessary for successful performance, all the way down to ABC analysis, antecedents, behaviors, and consequences. When we're at the org level, we are seeing the basic structure of the organization. And as I mentioned, the emphasis is on the relationships between the organization and its customers and the external environment, as well as the organization in terms of the functions or departments inside the organization and the relationships between those functions or departments. By the way, I can see the comments now. So if you have questions, if you have comments, if you want me to stop, if you want to chat about something related to it, I have no problem stopping at any point and answering questions or expanding the conversation a little bit. I like to start with analyzing a mission. Whenever I do systems analysis, my first stop is always, what is the mission of your organization? What is it that you exist to do or provide or produce? Because that should be driving everything else. Some interesting stats. Watson Wyatt Work study surveyed employees and organizations and found that companies whose employees understand the mission and goals enjoy a 29% greater return than other firms. But the flip side of that, unfortunately, according to Workplace 2000 Employee Insight Survey, 75% of workers feel that their company's mission statement has not been the way they do business. And even though they want to make a difference, they're not convinced that their organizations are really doing what their mission says they're doing. that's problematic. If you think about looking for a job and researching different organizations, a lot of us start by looking at that mission. I want to work someplace that's doing a good thing, or I want to work someplace that's making a difference. And mission statements usually tell us how they're doing a good thing or making a difference. If someone feels like they got the bait and switch, they come in and start working in the organization and say, you know what? I don't feel like you're working towards your mission at all. In fact, I think you're doing bad things, or you're not doing those good things in the right way. That's how you get turnover, you get low morale, you get what everyone loves to talk about, which is a bad organizational culture. So ensuring that you've got a good mission system or mission statement in place, and that everything else you're doing is to help your organization align with that mission is really job number one for systems analysis. When we don't have that in place, we get conflicting goals and management practices. It can lead to a reduction in productivity, and it can just create confusion throughout the organization. So the actions I like to take when I'm first doing a systems analysis are to identify and troubleshoot the organization's mission, and then move into sort of the really big picture goals for the organization through strategic planning and through strategic implementation. Now, before I go any further, I want to back up just a little bit and say that in my experience doing systems analysis, organizations want to do BSA typically in one of three situations. One, they just want to have their finger on the pulse of the organization. So they want to map everything out. They want to identify where they might have some opportunities for improvement and where their strengths are right now. So that's one way that I get brought in. The second is organizational initiatives. And that was in the title of the webinar that I so cleverly changed to be a totally different title when we started. But initiatives, organization-wide initiatives. You're going to do something big. You're going to double the number of clients you're taking. You are going to hire in a bunch of new staff. You're going to expand your funding sources. These are things that impact the entire organization from the top to the bottom, from inputs through outputs. So that's a really good time to use systems analysis through the lens of this initiative. So if I want to double the number of clients, I want to do a systems analysis that says, okay, what are the variables at the organization level that will impact and be impacted by increasing the number of clients? How are the functions going to impact and be impacted by this? What processes are involved? Which job roles are involved? So I might look at it just through a specific lens of an initiative. The third reason you might decide to do a systems analysis is if you know that there's a problem. So we are losing money, or there is a really big change coming, regulation change coming, and we know we're not at all prepared for it. So it's similar to doing the initiative analysis, but now you're looking at, okay, related to this problem, what are the processes? Who are the people involved in terms of job roles? What are the resources that are allocated to things that are impacted by this issue? So it doesn't matter which of those I'm doing, I'm still going to start with their mission and their strategic plan. So there are some specific questions. I've included a few. I'm not going to read all of them. I'll talk about them. If you want these slides, I am happy to send them to anyone who wants them. But the first thing we want to do is identify what is the mission. What is it that you provide, for whom, and why? And then if your organization has a mission statement, I recommend testing that mission statement to see if it passes Tom Gilbert's ACORN test. Tom Gilbert, some of you may be familiar with, he wrote the amazing book, Human Competence, that will be celebrating its 40th anniversary, I believe, coming up. Oh, we have a question. This question may be premature. Is there a task analysis for conduction of a systems analysis, concrete steps to follow? Yes, actually, there is a chapter in there's a chapter coming out in a book. There's a chapter in the book that I'm going to forget the name of the book overall. James Loselli was the editor. I wrote a chapter for it. I'll find it and send it to you, Christopher. But there is a book chapter in that book, Consultation in Organizations, that I did, and it actually walks through step by step how to do a systems analysis from the very beginning. A company approaches you, or you're within a company and you're charged with this, to the very end, evaluation and making changes. So good question. Yep. All right. So back to the ACORN test. Tom Gilbert developed the ACORN test to assess a mission, and it could be an organization-wide mission, it could be a job mission. But essentially it's looking at, have you really identified the reason why this organization or job exists in terms of what it does and for whom? Absolutely, Carrie. Yep. The ACORN test says, all right, A, have you identified an accomplishment and not just a process or a behavior or an activity? So is this something that the organization achieves? Is it under the control of the organization? So we may have really lofty missions that say, you know, I love Dick Malott because he has the loftiest mission of all. He's going to save the world with behavior analysis. And I think it's a great vision. I'm not sure it passes the ACORN test in terms of a mission statement. So is it under the control of the organization? Is it truly the overall objective for the organization? Meaning, if we did that, if we saved the world with behavior analysis, if my organization improved the quality of life for individuals diagnosed on the autism spectrum, would there still be anything that the organization would be expected to do beyond that? If so, you probably haven't identified your overall objective. Is it reconcilable? So if I am looking at the mission of the organization and different functions or jobs within the organization aren't able to be successful and still work toward the mission, or we could achieve our mission but at the expense of our customer somehow, then it's not reconcilable. And finally, can we actually measure something toward our mission? It doesn't mean that you have to have measures built into your mission, just that your mission should be the starting place for goals and measures. And if it's too fuzzy, if it's too, like I say to my students, unicorns and rainbows, that's probably not a good mission statement. It may be fine for a vision statement, but it's probably not a good mission statement. And finally, we want to know, see, I said I wasn't going to read all the questions, but I kind of am. How are we communicating that both internally and externally? So we want our customers to know who we are and why we exist. We also want our employees to know what we're working toward, what we're providing for whom and why, so that they can be on board with and champions for our mission. Once you have your mission outlined, I think it's really important to start setting goals. So again, that mission needs to be something fairly objective so that we can do this. I like to ensure that you have a strategic plan. Your strategic plan is about setting goals typically 3 to 5 years out. So your strategic plan needs to be updated every 3 to 5 years. Otherwise, you've got something collecting dust bunnies in a corner and you're not really using it. The strategic plan should be drafted with the mission plastered everywhere you can see it, so that you ensure any goals you set are really aligning well with why you say you exist as an organization, what you say you exist to do and for whom. You want to make sure that your strategic goals cover the areas of products and services. So what is it we do? Customers, for whom? And competitive advantages. How do we do it better than everybody else? I think that once you have that in place, you've done a lot, but you're definitely not done. One of the things, again, Rumler would say is strategic plans fail because there's rarely any strategic implementation planning. So once you have 3 to 5 year goals set out, you need to break those down. And it's easy if you say, okay, the 5-year goal is to increase revenue by 60%. It's easy enough to break that down into 2 to 4 year goals. So maybe, all right, if it's 5 years, then we should be at 50% by year 4 and 30% by year 3. So we can break it down that way. Then you need to break it down into that first year. So what are the goals for the first year? Fourth quarter, third quarter, second quarter, first quarter. At some point, it would be ridiculous to just say, oh, well, we should increase our revenue by 0.5%. It just stops making sense. Once it stops making sense, you know you're ready to get into, okay, now I need to look at more action-based goals. So maybe in the third quarter, I need to make sure that any systems changes I identified as being necessary have been developed and implemented. And maybe in the second quarter, I'm designing those changes. And maybe in the first quarter, I'm identifying what those changes could possibly be. At the end of an analysis, I would always circle back and say, okay, in that first quarter, now that I've done a systems analysis and I know how everything's going to be impacted, how do I break down my first quarter into what am I going to do this month? What do I need to accomplish by the end of next month? And where do I need to be by the end of the first quarter so that I can meet those first quarter goals? Once you've gotten that that's fine. What if the goals are not met? So if the goals for the strategic planning aren't met, it's not at all uncommon. For one, folks will find that they set really lofty goals in their strategic planning. And once they do the full analysis, they may have a bit of buyer's remorse with those goals. The nice thing is if you do a systems analysis before you go out and try to implement those goals, you'll identify all the changes necessary to hit those goals. And they're always big. We're talking 5-year goals. These are going to be big, big goals with lots of changes. So you can always just go back and adjust. If you think it's still doable and you're working on those goals, but you're getting into year 2, year 3, and you're saying, you know what, there's no way, it's okay to go back in and revisit those goals and say, how do we scale this? Can we scale it back? Were we too ambitious with our 5-year goal? Should we really say our 3-year goal is now our new 5-year goal and re-break it down to figure out what we need to do with the remaining time? Or sometimes you have a strategic goal that says, you know what, we're going to develop this partnership with someone and the partnership falls apart. Well, okay, then that's a goal we let go, and either we replace it with a new goal or we have enough other goals to focus on that we redirect our efforts into those other strategic goals until the next go around for strategic planning. Another thing to keep in mind is folks get a little nervous. They're like, oh gosh, if we're setting these strategic goals, is this all we're going to do? And I have other things I want my organization to do. And I remind folks that, you know, really 3 to 5 years is not a very long time. Just because you don't choose something for a strategic goal this time around doesn't mean you won't look at it next time around. So don't feel like it's eliminating things. Look at it as really making a commitment to working on a few things that you can do in the next 3 to 5 years. Good question. All right, one of my other favorite phrases from Rumler, you'll see a lot of Rumler and Bration here. It's because the Rumler and Bration Improving Performance book is hands down the best systems analysis book available. Gary Rumler was a genius, I think. And one of the sort of scary but really important phrases from that book is adapt or die. Organizations need to be adaptive. We need to be ready to adapt to the coming changes. If at all possible, we need to be proactive in adapting, meaning we should be adapting our organizations in preparation of large-scale changes, not either making large-scale changes or having large-scale changes happen that will affect our organization and then reactively addressing it. We should be proactively addressing it. Adaptive organizations have a much better chance of surviving and thriving. This is the whole open system versus closed system. This really is a point driven home a lot in general systems theory. They tend to outperform non-adaptive organizations, maybe in the most important way, and that is on several financial measures. And even not-for-profit organizations, public sector organizations, I know that money is not the #1 concern, but it has to be a concern, and it has to be a major concern because you need to make enough money to keep the lights on and continue to provide the services that you provide. If you're constantly running in the red, you risk your doors closing, and then where will your clients and employees be, right? Non-adaptive systems also have a tendency to throw bad money after good. We're unwilling to change. We're going to keep doing things that we've been doing, and that means investing resources in doing those things even if they haven't worked. And in those organizations, leaders are often seen as non-responsive or worse, and confidence really diminishes. You, again, might see the culture start looking worse and worse, and turnover increasing. Especially if you're throwing bad money after good, that means you don't have good money to put toward things like pay raises and updating materials and equipment, and providing incentives for your workers, and all the things that keep your employees and your customers happy. So looking at this adapt or die need of an organization, from a systems perspective, what we're doing is identifying and troubleshooting our products or services in our customer groups, evaluating measures around products or services and customer groups, looking at the inputs that come into the organization. So what are the financial, human, technological, and materials and equipment resources coming in that we will then convert into outputs for our customers, and those external environmental variables that are outside of your control but that impact your organization, as well as what your competition's doing. I do a lot of work in human services with autism providers, and when I start talking about competition, I'm usually met with, oh, well, there are so many clients, we could never serve them all, so we don't really worry about competition. And I have to remind folks that you're not just competing for your customers, you're competing for quality employees. If you rely on government funding, grant funding, you're competing for funding. So competition comes in a lot of different forms. It's not just customer competition. When we're looking at the products, services, and customer groups, we're looking at, well, what is it that we produce and who receives it? And how do we know that we're doing a good job at that? How do we know that we're hitting the right customers? Are we serving the right folks? Are we serving all of the folks we should be serving? What I see happen a lot is, are we serving too many different types of customers, and therefore we're not serving any of them well? Maybe we need to rein it in. How do we assess our provision of products and services? So if I'm an ABA service organization, how do I assess the quality of my ABA services? Internally, not just externally. Obviously, an external assessment would be on client outcomes. And of course, that's incredibly important. That's also often a bit of a lag measure. We may not see those changes immediately. I should also know that my clinicians are implementing with fidelity. I should also know that my programs are designed based on client needs, real client needs as perceived by the family or teachers. I should know that I'm using absolute best practices in the field. So really taking a hard look at, what am I providing? How do I know that the customers are happy? How do I know I'm serving the right customers? And how do we know internally that we're doing a good job? What are our standards for our products or services before they even leave the organization, before they're consumed or enjoyed by the client or the customer? And then finally, every organization needs to make enough money to stay afloat. If you're in a for-profit organization, you need to do more than that. You need to be coming out ahead. That's what for-profit means. So we want to look at financial outputs to make sure that they're sufficient to meet the internal needs as well as stakeholder needs. I like to use tables as much as possible, Excel files, things like that. So I just have these things broken down. When you're measuring customer satisfaction or products and services in OBM, when we look at measures, we're usually looking at quality, quantity, timeliness, and cost. So here I have quality, quantity, timeliness, and profit loss. And then get data. As behavior analysts, we know the importance of data, and yet when I work with clients and when I work with students and start asking about, well, how are you internally assessing service quality or service timeliness or the profit loss around providing specific services, I'm often met with blank stares. And that's not good. We need to be collecting those data. I want to know not just how one client is doing. I want to know across clients how we're doing. I want to have a goal level, and I want to know where we stand right now and how that compares to goal level. For inputs, you're just really assessing whether you have the finances that you need to run your organization successfully. Do you have enough people, and do you have the right people? Are you able to recruit and then retain quality, qualified employees? Are you getting the best of the best? Do you create a competitive advantage for employees, and then do your employees create a competitive advantage for you? How so? Do you have the right materials, tools, equipment, and technology? Are your do you have quality standards in place for all of your incoming resources? And what do you do to make sure that where you get those resources from, you have a good relationship there? So I often hear folks say, well, you know, it's really hard to get qualified staff. And I say, well, where are you getting them from? And they sort of get a variety of answers. And then I usually follow up with, well, what's your relationship with local or regional universities? Or are you using these different job services? And what's your relationship with recruiters? So it's really important to make sure that you have a good relationship with any supplier of any input into your organization, because those inputs are what you need to make outputs. Environmental variables, we're really looking at things like regulations, the local economy, the local culture. So if you're in ABA service delivery, what's the local perception of behavior analysis? Because depending where you are, that might look very different. If you're working in a major industry, maybe you're in chemicals or, you know, gas, and you're working within a town or a city, what's the culture like regarding how the community feels about your organization or your industry? That tells you a lot. It's going to help identify whether you'll struggle getting employees, whether you'll struggle getting customers, whether you need to do some branding within your community. Looking at also, who are you competing with for customers, human resources, and other inputs? Like I mentioned earlier, it's not just customers that you compete for. You're also competing for your employees. Employees have choices, and you want them to choose you. You also want to look at, well, what are our advantages compared to our competition? And then what are our competition's advantages compared to us? So where are we ahead, and how do we stay ahead? Where are they ahead, and how do we close that gap? Once you have all this information, we put it together into a super system map if you're reading Rumler, an organizational system map if you're reading anything that I've written lately with my work partner, Lori Ludwig. Total performance system if you're reading Dale Brethauer, another one of my heroes. But basically, they're all talking about this. It's a big map. And at the very top, let's see if you can see my, there we go. At the very top are those external environmental variables: economy, regulations, industry, culture, any sort of geographic or natural environment concerns, market demand, our mission and strategies, resources and suppliers. This is us, the company right here. The financial outputs going to stakeholders, our internal measures of quality, quantity, timeliness, and cost, our customers, who they're adding value for, their feedback, and then competition, competing for customers and resources. What we do typically is build this map, then we analyze the system looking for disconnects. A lot of times just answering those questions will identify disconnects. It absolutely will. I like to then take those disconnects and input them into the map just by changing the font color red. And then I'll usually include a summary of disconnects box, or maybe a supplemental documentation or a document that explains the disconnects. Once we've done that, then we can move into identifying how do we close those gaps and fix the system issues. So how do we get more resources, or how do we reallocate resources? How do we just, in a lot of cases, I'll tell you what, the very first thing I find almost every single time is A, there's no strategic goals. B, We do not have in place solid product service measures. Maybe some customer feedback is often informal, but very seldom is it formal. So I almost inevitably start by identifying, okay, let's get a strategy in place and let's get some serious measures in place, and let's collect data so we know whether what we think is an issue really is an issue. When you're working within an organization, you are typically working in a department or a function of that organization. And typically, organizations are managed pretty vertically, meaning there's someone in charge of the department or the function, and they report up to the person above them, who reports up to the person above them. And resources are allocated by department or function, and everything moves up and down, but nothing moves across. And when everything's moving up or down, departments have their own goals that are not set in the context of the larger system. They're set in terms of, what do I want to do in my department to get more resources and to make sure I'm producing my outputs. And that can lead to what we call sub-optimization, which is one function does really well, but at the expense of another function. That leads to the blame game, where if you've ever done performance improvement and you've interviewed or surveyed employees, you've probably experienced this. You start asking what the issues are, and they'll say, well, the problem is that these other guys, whatever, insert department name here, they do these things, and then it means we can't do our job, or we get stuff to them, but then they don't do it right. And then you go to the other department and they're blaming the first department. That's because they're not being managed cross-functionally. They're not looking at each other as suppliers and customers, and that's what we want to do. We want to look at, if I'm a function or if I work within a department of the organization that produces something for a different department of the organization, I need to look at that other department as my customer. I am their supplier. They need to consider me a supplier. We need to have a good relationship. We need to establish goals that ensure that we're both able to produce our outputs in the way we need to. That's usually missing as well. So we're troubleshooting those inputs and outputs and ensuring that our goals, measures, and resources are set based on cross-functional success. So really, you're just asking, what are those inputs and outputs? Who are they going to, and how are we measuring success? And are both the supplying and receiving function involved in the goals and measures, and are they finding them to be acceptable? When you've done that, you end up with a different map. We love maps in systems analysis. If we think of this box right here as that organization box, this is you as a system. Inside all these boxes are different departments or functions, or maybe a department with sub-departments or functions within it. All the inputs and outputs are represented by arrows. You may sometimes include those external suppliers if there are specific inputs coming in, or the external customer if there are specific outputs going from a function out to the customer. What I always tell students is, when you're doing your input-output map, your relationship map, and you find that all your arrows going out are going to the external customer and all your arrows coming in are coming from your suppliers, you haven't really broken down your inputs and outputs. You're thinking too globally. You need to break that down into smaller outputs and where they're going inside the organization, because we can't improve those relationships if we don't know what those relationships are. Once we get into the process level, we still see those basic structures, but we're really, really looking at those interrelations between the functions and within functions. We're essentially looking at workflow. We're not looking at individuals yet. We're not looking at specific jobs typically. We're looking at departmental or functional processes or cross-functional processes. If you've ever done a task analysis for everyone, for a client, for staff, for yourself, whatever it may be, you've got some experience in process analysis already. You've broken down a process or a performance into its component steps, and that's what process analysis is. Rumler, Ramus, and Wilkins defined a process as a construct for organizing value-adding work to achieve a business value milestone. That may seem wordy and sort of fluffy, but what it's really getting at is processes only exist to help the organization. If you have a lot of processes in place that don't seem to produce something that adds value at the organization level, you need to reassess that process and why it's in place. But conversely, an organization is only as effective as its processes, because that's how the work gets done. So what we're doing here is evaluating the workflow and internal measures of quality, quantity, timeliness, and cost. So at the organization level, we're looking at our overall products and services in terms of quality, quantity, timeliness, and cost. At process, we're looking at maybe an output that's not the final product or service. We're looking at the inputs and outputs between those organizations, or between those organizational functions, and we're looking at quality, quantity, timeliness, and cost of those. So we want to know, is it designed to be optimally efficient? Is it designed cross-functionally? One of my big pet peeves is when folks are doing process analysis, but they're only looking in a single function. You may as well be doing what I talked about earlier, which is doing performance management without looking at the impact on the system. If we only do one functional process, again, we can have functional optimization and organizational sub-optimization. So one function can improve and end up hurting another function. So you want to make sure you analyze a process across multiple functions, scope it so that it's running across multiple functions, so that you know what's happening before it gets to your department and where it goes after. What we would call before would be upstream, and then after would be downstream. Is this arranged in a way so that we're assessing quality, quantity, timeliness, and cost? Is it arranged to be easily or relatively easily managed? Who's managing cross-functional workflow? Not who's managing the functions involved, but who's actually managing the process? And usually the answer there is nobody. And that's an opportunity to improve performance. At the very least, it's an opportunity to identify which functions are involved, which departments are involved, who's managing each of those departments or functions. How do I get these folks together at least once a month to review process performance? When you've mapped out a process, it looks something like this. We like to put the phases. So if I had to break my process down into 5 big steps, those would be the phases, or sometimes called a macro process. And then within each phase, what are the steps required to produce the output of that particular phase? So each phase has an output, and then the overall process has an output. Each task also has an output, but usually in process analysis, I argue that you need to analyze the end of process output in terms of quality, quantity, timeliness, and cost. You also need to analyze and make sure you're doing ongoing goals and measures for end of phase measures, because a lot of times end of phase also means it's moving from one department or function to another. And then as necessary, you can put measures on individual steps. If the step is critical, if there's a high probability of it going wrong or being skipped, then you might want to put measures on it and set goals. But otherwise, end of phase and end of process for sure. And again, just like with the other maps, what I would do is go in, identify the disconnects, mark them red, include a summary of disconnects, so that when we get to the point of identifying solutions in the organization, we know exactly where to look and what we should be focusing on. Finally, we get to the performer level. This is probably the level that's going to be most familiar to folks. We're looking at individual jobs and how they support functional and cross-functional performance. We're looking at how individuals perform within jobs, and we're essentially doing our performance management here. When jobs aren't aligned with process, we can get caught up with measuring and managing a lot of non-value adding behaviors. I talked about that earlier. That can lead to a lot of confusion over someone's role and purpose. Imagine that you have performer goals in place and you're hitting your performer goals, but the department's not doing well, so you're still getting yelled at. That's usually an indicator that those goals are not well aligned. That can lead to inappropriate reinforcement or punishment. So we like to start by identifying and troubleshooting job metrics, and then align the job measures with workflow and function measures. So what is it that the job does? What are the key outputs? Which internal or external customer receives each of those outputs? How are we measuring those outputs and managing those outputs in terms of quality, quantity, timeliness, and cost? Make sure we have goals in place. How are those measures contributing to workflow? And how are needs and feedback communicated back to the people in the job? Once we know that, we need to look at, are we giving the folks what they need to be successful? So do they have sufficient resources to do their part in the development and delivery of services? So do they have the time, the tools, the autonomy, the training that they need, the prerequisite knowledge and skills to be effective and efficient in their job? What we find is they often don't. My biggest concern when I'm doing performer level analysis is around training. I think that there are issues in training. I don't know that enough people are truly expert in what performance-based training is, or a behavior analytic approach to training is. It goes well beyond behavioral skills training. So I don't think we have enough expertise in our organizations. But two, the concern is, and I see this from behavior analysts, which is surprising to me, if someone's not performing, they need more training. Well, that's not always true. In fact, it's almost the minority of time that they would need training. Now, if the training's not good, then of course they probably do need training, but training's not going to be enough. That's antecedents without consequences. We want to make sure there are consequences in place as well. Without consequences, you get these stats. 23% of workers say they're performing to their full capacity. 44% they say that they don't do more than what's required. And the number one reason for leaving a job is lack of praise and recognition. So we need to make sure we're planning, measuring, and managing performance. So make sure they're getting feedback, and that feedback is in relation to goals or standards. Make sure that those goals and standards are set fairly and are consistently being met. And if they're not, you're troubleshooting. You're doing ABC analysis. You're doing a resource analysis to make sure they have everything they need. Once you have the outputs defined, you can start breaking it down into tasks, component tasks, and look at if the output's not occurring, which tasks are they struggling with, and tailor your intervention around what needs to be improved, not just throwing the kitchen sink at everything. Earlier I mentioned these. When you look at resources, you're making sure they have the time, the tools or equipment, the training, the information, job procedures, a logical workflow within which to work, clear performance expectations, positive consequences, not just if you don't do it, you're in trouble, or if you don't do it, we'll threaten that you'll be in trouble, but you won't really be in trouble, but actual positive consequences. We should know when people are doing a good job, and we should be acknowledging that and celebrating it. So wherever possible, we should have performance-based incentives in place. And then looking sort of big picture, for an individual, are there any org issues that are interfering with their ability to be successful? So at the job level, maybe we put everything in place and they're still not doing a good job. It might be a process issue. That might be an organization-wide issue. So I see this a lot when I work with ABA service agencies. It's really hard to get and keep all the staff you need. And so then you can have folks who just have too much on their plate. And no matter what you do, until you remove some of those responsibilities, they're going to be unable to be wholly successful. And if you keep too much on their plate for too long, you are really at a high risk for losing those folks. And that usually means you're losing your best performers, which is not good. So making sure that those issues are managed, making sure that you create a safe and happy and ergonomically sound environment. And if you are charging people with tasks and outputs, make sure that you actually give them the time and space to get that done. So another thing I hear a lot is that, well, we need the paperwork to get done, notes need to be written, documentation needs to be done. But if you ever go out and watch people working, it's not like they're slacking off. It's just that they're getting pulled away from it. There's no opportunity to sit and get something done. So that needs to be programmed in for them. So we're looking at performance planning and performance managing. So specifications, process and tools, resources, training, information, and then managing the performance with feedback, consequences, and incentives. You'll see that there are 2 layers of managers in here. That's to show that if I want this person to do these things for his or her employees, I need to make sure that this person is putting performance planning and management in place for this person. So the up and down performance management, performance systems analysis. But again, we don't do that in isolation. This needs to be working with the other jobs. This person needs to work with other departments or functions in terms of the functional performance and process performance. That sort of leads us into the very last thing I was going to talk about. Sorry, I'm going a little over, but I promise I'm almost done. Across all levels, you need to be planning, measuring, and managing performance so that it aligns up, down, and across. This will give you more opportunities for reinforcement and rewards. And as behavior analysts, that's what we should always be focused on, is identifying opportunities to provide reinforcement. I think it's Daniels who says catching them being good. We tend to lose sight of our science sometimes when we're staff facing versus client facing. And so having systems in place to make sure that you're using positive reinforcement with employees is really important. It also then gives us the structure that we need to ensure that our business goals are met. And it clarifies expectations. I can't tell you how many different types of organizations and how many different industries that I've worked with where when it gets down to it and you're talking to folks doing the work, they'll tell you, I don't really know what's expected of me. They don't make that clear. And I talk to managers and managers say, well, I don't understand why they're not doing what they should be doing and why they're not getting it done and why they're not hitting goals. And you talk to the employees, they're like, what goals? I didn't know about any goals. What are the goals? That's not even my job. That's somebody else's job. And then you talk to the other person, they're like, that's not my job. So clarifying performance expectations across all levels of performance. So we design and implement performance measurement systems. And if we're looking sort of up and down the organization and across, who collects and reports the strategic and tactical organization measures and the cross-functional and functional measures? So the org level. What tools or systems do they use to collect and report the data? When do they collect and report the data? To whom are they reporting? And how are those data used to analyze deviations from goals and take corrective action? And how is that info used to guide then downstream workflow goals, design, and measures? At the workflow or process level, who's collecting and reporting those data? What tools or systems are they using? When do they do it? To whom are they reporting? How are they analyzing the data? And then how are they using that information to guide the performer level? So the job goals, design, and measures down at the performer level. And then finally, at the performer level, who's collecting and reporting the data? What tools, systems are they using to report those data? When and to whom? And how is that being used to analyze deviations from goals and take corrective actions? Your goal is to make sure all of those things are aligned, that this system, above all others, is put into place, that we are collecting data at every level, and that the data and information at the higher levels drives the goals and measures at the lower levels. If you do it that way rather than the other way, having it go from the bottom up, you could get the company going in a million different directions. From the top down, in terms of goal setting and measures and the level approach, you're going to make sure that down at the individual performer level, I know that those goals and measures contribute to process. And at the process level, I know that those goals and measures are contributing up to the org level, which is contributing to our strategy, which is allowing us to work toward our mission. That was an awful lot. Any last minute questions? Again, I'm happy to send any of the slides to you or additional information. Okay, we have a question. So any advice for special ed teacher BCBA looking to conduct a systems analysis for their own nonprofit? To conduct a systems analysis, does one need to have access to org level info, financial reports, and the like? Yes and no. You don't directly need that information if it's not possible to get it. It's always helpful to have it. But if you are not in a position to get it, what you can do is analyze the levels that you're able to analyze, keeping in mind those higher level systems factors. So you might not do a full org level analysis, strategy, goals and measures, financial information. But if you're doing process and performer, you should be making notes of, okay, what org level variables would be impacted or would impact this. And then you can present that up and say, this is what I've come up with. However, I think if you're to consider this, you first need to look at the financials and this. So you can basically direct the folks above you in terms of what they would need to look at in order to make sure any changes you're designing will be successful. Oh, thank you so much for the presentation. Thank you. Can I give you the full reference for Rumler-Brache? Yeah, absolutely. It is, the book is called Improving Performance, How to Manage the White Space on the Organizational Chart. It's a long name. If you just Google Rumler-Brache Improving Performance, it'll come up for sure. I will definitely send the slides and resources and the chapter. And let's see, willing to share your slides? Yep, absolutely. Yep, absolutely. For sure. Thank you, guys. Let me unshare my screen. I guess I could have done that while we were doing the other stuff. But it was a lot of fun, even though I was just talking to myself, I think. I'm glad you're all there. I'm glad you're chiming in now. And thank you for the questions throughout. There were a couple of questions, and that's always nice. Stay in touch. My email before we go is heather.mcgee@wmich.edu. So heather.mcgee@wmich.edu. And it looks like the OBM network has put that up in the chat. So I will send you those slides, anyone who sends me their email, or if you just want to shoot me an email, that would be great. Bye.